This project is doing a 2-run reduction print or a 2-color reduction print. In a reduction print, it's a color print, but we're only using 1 block. Now you guys have already done a 2-block print, right? You did your sampler and then your key, and we printed those together and made them work by the way that we designed the key and also through controlling the values of the ink. In your last project, you had a little bit more free form on how the blocks went together. You made small little stamps out of the Speedy Carve material, and you combined that with the gel printing plate and stamping and some good trash in there as well. So you've already got 2 color print techniques under your belt. This one, we're gonna, like I said, use 1 block. It's important that you prep a lot of pieces of paper, because once we carve this and print it on all the pieces of paper, and then we're going to come back and carve more on the same block and print it again, once we've carved away that first run, there's no printing it over. It's a closed edition kind of thing. So it's really important you have enough pieces of paper going so that you can carve and print and carve and print and do as many runs as you want. Or as many prints as one would want, okay? For this project, you guys only have to do 2 carved runs. So getting your design on here, carving for the first run, printing in light colored blends, light value of blends, then coming back to the same block, carving it to a finished block, and then printing on top of those first layers that you've already printed. So we know that a good black and white relief block has about 50% of the block carved away, approximately. So knowing that, and knowing that you have to do 2 runs, we could back up the percentages and say the first run you want to have about 25% carved away, and the second run you want to be at sort of your key block stage and have 50 or even 60% of the block carved away. This, I think, is a really good way to think about your strategy and your plan for how you're going to make the reduction print. The reality is, after you print a second run, you might decide to do a third run, and that's fine. And maybe you carve past that 50% carved area. Great. There's a lot of different right ways to do this. Also, you could print a first run without doing any carving. In terms of the project, that's not going to count as one of your carved and printed runs, so just keep that in mind. You can keep carving, reducing the block, and printing as long as you still have some material on the block. So some people do many prints, many runs, and in that case they're just changing the block really incrementally each time. With just doing 2 runs, we're making pretty drastic carve changes to the block each time. So to prep your drawing, you would just do it as you would any other relief print. So sketchbook sketches, photo references, coming up with your idea, getting it down onto tracing paper, full scale. And then, as I'm sure you remember, transferring to the block is very easy with Speedy Carve. You can just flip this upside down, because of course it'll print back in that orientation, and rub the back, and the graphite is going to transfer onto your block. Do not go over this with Sharpie or anything else. You don't need to. We know that the graphite really persists on the block. I have my sampler block here that I've printed easily 40 times by now, and I can still see traces of my pencil marks on here. That's important because after we print our first run and come back to carve more, we don't want to have to transfer our image again. We want to just have that image already in the block, and we can just go ahead and do our carving for the next part. Reduction prints can be very overwhelming. They're much more complicated explaining them than they are doing them. So just think about the decision that's ahead of you. Come up with your drawing. Then you transfer it. Then you review all the examples I have for you on what sort of things to be carving for your first run. And then you do that, and then you concentrate on how am I going to print this. We're doing the same sort of size we've done on the sampler and key block prints. So this is a 3x4 block, and we're printing on the 5x6 washi that we're going to hand print. So you're going to use that same registration board that you used for those first prints. What I really recommend with the reduction process is that once you have your full scale drawing, I just photocopied this a couple times on my printer, or copied it on my printer, and then I took 2 Prismacolor pencils, but it could be crayons, it could be chalk, could be markers, whatever. And I drew them in 2 different ways, just to get some idea of where will these 2 colors hit and where do I want them to be at the end when I print this. And that's going to, of course, inform how I'm going to do the carving. When you carve for your first run and you print your first run, regardless if you're only inking with one color over the whole block or a blend, you're basically going to have the one color or the color of the ink, but you're also going to have the whites of the paper. So I made a really big point of making sure I was incorporating the whites of the paper in here. So even though it's 2 runs, it's really already automatically 3 colors. Color of the paper, color of the first run print, color of the second run print. And by the second run print, you should be kind of finished with your image. There should be fully dark inking, and finishing your print. So I'm going to walk you through all of this. I have already carved for my first state here, and I'm ready to print it. So I'm going to do that, see what it looks like, and then walk you through how you complete this. So I've set up the usual way. This is, of course, the Akua Liquid Pigment. It's all evaporated and ready to go. I'm using a lot of leftovers that I had mixed up for prior projects. So I hope you're keeping leftovers in little containers. Also, at this point in the semester, you may well need to put a couple more drops of mineral oil on your Baron pad because it might start pulling a little bit when you're printing. And if you feel that, put a couple more drops of oil on that. Same with your spoon. You might want to add a couple more. Like I usually just put some on here and then rub the spoon on it and you're good to go. Another thing that I did is that I rinsed my block. I didn't wash it, I just rinsed it. And that got rid of some of the excess graphite that's on here, and so now it won't smear and it'll have less likelihood of off printing when I do my printing. So you could use extender to make your colors more transparent, or you could use white, or you could use a combination and play with the opacity or transparency of the color. Remember that this ink is very transparent to begin with. What you're looking for is you really want a medium sort of value for this first run of a 2-run print. So, you want something that's sort of like this in value. For comparison, here's the Quin Red, pretty dark, but if I mix a teeny bit of that into the white, that'll be good. Of course, yellows straight out of the bottles are probably good to start. Like other projects that I've required from you guys, I want all different blends on your first run. So changing the colors, shifting them slightly from one thing to another is what I want to see with these. You're going to turn in 3 finished prints, and they need to all have different color combinations, both in this first run that you're printing and in your final run that you're printing. So you all know how to do this by now. Get a blend on here. You could, just do all sorts of stuff. So I'm going to do kind of the usual thing that you've seen me do. Ink up like this. Turn the block around and ink the other way. And that way I get a nice framing with the darker color at the top of the bottom. Remember that you want to be always putting your block in the same place every time and cinching it up to this corner or just a consistent corner. I can see that I didn't ink up on this edge. Remember how these blocks do tend to sometimes have kind of a beveled sort of edge, so be sure that that's inking up. To help me remember, I'm going to make myself, I have a face on mine, pretty obvious face, so I'm going to make myself a note like this. That's kind of creepy, I don't know, but okay, that's better. That's how I'm going to put my block in each time. Just helps me, not forget in the fun of printing and do something else. Also, as usual, printing on the smooth side. Like any other printing, not every single one is going to be good. They might be too dark. They might, you know, you might miss printing a corner. You might miss printing the edge. You know that by now. All these different things could happen. So be sure you have a generous amount of pieces of paper going. With reduction prints, we're not proofing on newsprint. Sometimes for a last run, I do start proofing on newsprint. But for a first run, I just jump right in with my prints and good paper. So you guys are turning in 3 final prints that have the 2 layers or more on them. So in the meantime, every single print you're keeping them because you just don't really know what they're going to look like until you finish printing the 2 runs on them. So this is cool. It's not too dark, but it definitely shows. I can see all my carved marks on there. I can see that I have a bit of something here. That tends to happen with a block. I didn't go over it and make sure all those little carved pieces were removed. So what I might do, well, no. I was going to say mark this that it isn't perfect, but you know what? That might end up being covered up by the time I'm done. So sometimes we don't have extra margins to write a note for yourself, but sometimes I'll make a little mark, and that sort of is a reminder to me that maybe that wasn't the most perfect print. So changing every time that I print, subtly, pretty much gonna keep this. I've really gotten to the point where all I do is I just use my fingers to add ink each time. This is completely non-toxic ink, so, and water-based, so it's very easy to clean it off your fingers. Okay, very little difference with these two, but as I go, I'm going to keep changing the colors every time. Notice that here I am a few hours in at least, right? The time it took to come up with my image, to transfer it, to figure out what I was going to carve for my first run. And then you pull your print and it looks like this. In other words, it doesn't look like a whole lot yet. In a 2-run reduction, we want to start establishing figure-ground relationships. So notice that I can definitely see shapes in this. I've already started to establish that on my print. Now you might print one and realize that you really haven't carved enough, so you could just stop and keep going, carve some more, and then continue your first run. It's fine if there's some variation in the states of the block. Also, these are monoprints, so if you have different brands or colors, in other words, cream, buff, tan, natural, white, your paper can be different papers if you want. So if you've kind of run out of one paper and you want to buy a different one and have a variation, that's totally great, totally fine. You can tap in color if you want. You can also, if you want to, you could take a Q-tip and wipe away some of the ink in places if you want. With the small scale blocks, it's easy to kind of overdo it, but definitely experiment with that if you want. So this is very, very light. I have a lot of salt and pepper, but it's still a keeper. Also, what might happen is that I might decide to do 3 runs on some of the prints, and the other ones will be finished with just 2 runs, and so that's an option. So you can see on both of these that I tapped in color. Now as I look at this, I'm looking at the white spaces that I'm creating, and I just want to make sure that it's not setting up some sort of weird void on the side. Remember, these are prints where we're going to have margins, so I want this first run to establish the image area, but I also want it to have the highlights of the white of the paper and start to see shapes being developed. If your print isn't at this similar sort of amount carved away, then you've got to carve a lot more for sure. So you can see I have some variation, and as usual when I'm printing, I started with this one, and then by the time I printed this last one, it was looking like this. So I slowly just keep adding, tapping in really small amounts of ink, and I just keep printing. I recommend that you have at minimum 12 sheets of paper going. Maximum, I would say maybe 20. That should give you more than enough to do test proofs, practice ones if you're unsure about the color, sort of warm-up prints, if you will, and give you more than enough so that if there's registration issues or other issues, you'll have at least 3 good ones at the end, if not a lot more to choose from for this project. You can certainly print a lot more than that. It just kind of depends, like how many do you want to have at the end of this. You know, there is no block left by the end. I mean, you'll have a key block here, but you won't be able to repeat these color prints. So thinking about how much do you like your image and how many prints do you want, and then just adjust your paper number accordingly. So here are all the prints I've printed for my first run. And as I said before, I usually start very plain, and by the time I'm finished, I'm tapping in color in different places and using the edge of the brayer and making marks. I did some diagonal blends, which were fun, but these are all in the same kind of medium value. Also, some prints have things wrong, like I missed rolling with the brayer right here, so it's a little light. I kind of have a similar situation on this one. Doesn't matter, these are all keepers for now. Subsequent runs can cover up lap marks or other marks from the brayer or inking that weren't perfect. So don't get rid of anything. You're going to keep everything. What I find is that I often do more than one printing session for a first run, and that's just sort of what I do as a strategy to help me reset and have a totally different kind of palette going. These all tend to be very brownish and muted sort of colors, and I want to print some more that have really high intensity, I don't know, reds and blues or something like that. So I'll probably just do that another day before I go to carving for my second run. When you go to get ready to print your last run, your second run, I would sort through your prints and then put the ones that you don't love, you know, which for me would probably be the plain ones, I don't know, or the ones that have printing issues of some kind, like this one that was so light. Have that at the top of your pile, and those are the ones that you're going to start printing with. Save the ones you love, like I love this one and this one, you know, for ones that you print later on, once you've already printed and you can tell that your second run is how you like it in terms of the carving and stuff. 2 main things you can do wrong with the first run. 1 is not carving enough. 2 is over inking. So be sure that you're getting a nice even inking, not real globs of ink, all that sort of stuff. With this ink, as you know, it's pretty forgiving. So, but you want to have blends definitely are required, and you want to get that whole block printing really well so that if you want to, for the second and last run, you can carve inside the edge and make registration really easy. One thing I did in the carving of this one, which you will notice, I think, if you look at my instructions, that one thing I talk about is changing all the marks, and that each time you carve for a reduction, you should change all the marks and then add new marks, and that's a good strategy for having registration be easy. Well, with this, I have established some edges that are going to continue in the next run, like the whites of the eyes is always something that people tend to want to carve that away completely for a first run. Just know that those are going to be areas where I really have to have my registration hitting dead on. So you can do that. There's lots of strategies for how you can carve. Just be really paying attention to your registration when you print your first run, because that's going to set you up for success. this now shows the state of my block. Remember when I carved and printed my first run, it looked like this. Now I'm carving and I'm finishing my block. So I'm thinking of it like a key block, and I'm finishing up all the carving, finishing up all of the details of the marks. When you print your first run, you get the color of the paper and then of course the color of the ink. When you print your second run, you're going to get the color that you're inking here, and you're going to see that first run of color. So a way to think about how you're going to do the carving, or another way to think about it, is wherever you carve, you're going to see your first layer of color. Unlike the first run where I really didn't proof or anything, the second run, or the final state of the block, I do pull proofs, and this is just in black to see what's going on with it. What I do is I took a pencil and I circled little areas where I needed to clean up the carving. It didn't look very right. And so I went back to carving, and I then pulled a second proof, cleaned it up quite a bit, cleaned up those areas that I had identified, but then I still saw some stuff that I didn't like. Some chatter, and some of the rounded forms weren't carved as nicely and as cleanly as I want, so I carved more, and then I pulled another proof, and now it's getting a lot cleaner. There isn't chatter except where I want there to be chatter. Really cleaned it up a little bit, but I still noticed some little stuff, so I stopped and carved again. I didn't bother cleaning the block. I just sort of put a piece of paper over it, and this is now my final state of the block. So things that I've changed are really kind of subtle, but I did more carving in here, and added some other little stuff, mostly cleaned up in here. There was a section here where I just had never carved that, so I needed to do that. And that's pretty much it. I changed the shape of the lips a little bit, if you look at it here as opposed to up here. And the nose a little bit, just fine tuning. Now I'm ready to print on top of those first run prints, the color prints that I've printed already. So what I want you guys to do is have all your prints be different. You don't have to necessarily print the second run in a blend, but you can. This shows two prints that I printed on first, and I really love how this is looking. I'm really excited. I like how much white there is in there. I really like on this one where I tapped in the color on the first run. It really gives the eyes a different color. It makes them pop in the print. I printed one more. I printed on this one, which was that really light one from the first run. And what I was really looking at now is I was looking at registration, and also trying out a blend. So this is just black, and then this one is black, and then it's a blend with ochre. What I noticed is that these were two of the prints that I chose to print on first because they weren't printed very well along the bottom. Remember that eased sort of edge, sometimes it doesn't print very well. But then I printed this one, and notice how my key plate, or my second state of my reduction block, isn't lining up really perfectly along the bottom of these prints. And at first I thought, well, I didn't print the first run correctly. And then I realized, no, that for some reason, because it was lining up perfectly on the edges, right? It was lining up perfect here and here. Somehow my block has kind of spread a little bit or something, and that can sometimes happen with material that it sort of hangs over the edge. And this also is happening over that eased kind of edge. So what I did before I printed, actually I haven't printed again yet, but I went in and I actually trimmed all of these just a teeny bit so that they're off the bottom of the print so that they will line up better. So here's the print that I printed after I carved just a little bit off of those shapes at the bottom, and now it lines up just spot on. So realize that you might have to do some carving to adjust the registration, and I would say that you should print to check that. Don't just assume it's not going to line up or something. Print a couple of them. You should have enough prints that you could do that. Some final reminders. You're required to do at least 2 runs for the reduction. You can do more if you want, you can do 3. You're going to carve and print, and then you're going to carve some more on the same block and print them on top. And the first week you're going to work on the first run, and the second week you're going to finish up and have your completed prints. Remember that this is what you're turning in. You're not going to turn in sort of the deconstructed one or the proofs of the second block by itself. What I'm looking for is that you've carved enough that you're showing that you understand how reduction works. The number one thing you could do wrong is not carve enough. Because you're only doing 2 runs, you've got to have a pretty noticeable jump in the amount of carving on the block for success. That's kind of the number one thing to do right and the number one thing that people do wrong. So pay attention to that. There's also lots of information up on Canvas, and there is visuals of these prints as well as other reduction prints that I've done that walk you through the steps and what you should be considering and what you should be thinking about at each stage so that you will have success in your prints. So good luck, happy printing.